Get your bag now. The officers are waiting outside. The words sliced through the first-class cabin of Skybridge Airlines Flight 847 like a blade through silk. Every head in the luxurious section snapped toward seat 1, A, expecting to see chaos. Instead, they saw a woman in a simple black sweater quietly sipping sparkling water, her Kindle resting in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't even pressed the call button. But the flight attendant standing over her was shaking with rage that made absolutely no sense. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Drop your city or country. And if you've ever been wrongly judged by your appearance, this story will hit you harder than turbulence. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to witness will shock you to your core. The woman in seat 1A was Dr. Amara Richards, 34 years old, with dark skin that seemed to absorb the cabin's ambient lighting and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She wore no jewelry, carried no designer bags, displayed no obvious signs of wealth. To anyone glancing over, she looked like a graduate student traveling on a scholarship, or perhaps a social worker flying to a conference. She was neither. Standing over her was Victoria Cross 29, the kind of beautiful that opened doors and stopped conversations. Platinum blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon red lipstick applied with surgical precision and a uniform tailored to showcase every curve. Victoria had transformed the standard Skybridge flight attendant outfit into something that belonged on a runway. She was elegant, polished, and absolutely stunning. She was also about to make the biggest mistake of her career. "I said get up." Victoria hissed, her manicured fingers tightening around the leather seat back. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no by a passenger. "Security is waiting at the gate. You've caused enough disruption for one flight." Amara closed her Kindle with deliberate slowness. She didn't pull away from Victoria's looming presence. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the flight attendant's name tag and smiled a smile that was terrifyingly calm. "Careful, Victoria," she whispered, her voice so low that only the blonde could hear it. "You have no idea what you just started." The cabin around them was holding its breath. Passengers in the other first-class suites had stopped their conversations. Their tablets paused mid-swipe, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. The tension was so thick you could taste it. In seat 2, B, a middle-aged white man named Bradley Pierce, was already reaching for his phone. His eyes lit up with the kind of excitement people get when they stumble across a car accident. He started recording whispering commentary like he was providing color commentary for a sporting event. Finally, he muttered to himself loud enough for several people to hear. Someone maintaining standards. In seat 3, a Rachel Thompson, a 35-year-old mother of 2 from Denver, felt her stomach turn. She'd seen this before. She knew exactly what this was, and it made her sick. Her hand instinctively moved toward her own phone, but she hesitated. Getting involved meant taking a side. Taking a side meant potential consequences. But staying silent meant being complicit. Victoria straightened to her full height, her authority radiating like heat. She'd done this dance before, though never with someone who remained this calm. Most passengers either exploded in anger, which gave her justification, or cowered in fear, which made her feel powerful. This woman was doing neither. "Ma'am," Victoria said loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "you're going to need to gather your belongings and come with me. We've had reports of disruptive behavior, and for the safety of all passengers." Reports from whom Amara interrupted gently. Her voice was so soft that people leaned forward to hear it. "I've been sitting here reading for the past 2 hours. I haven't spoken to anyone except to order water. So, who exactly reported disruptive behavior?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria's perfect composure flickered for just a moment like a candle in the wind. She glanced around the cabin, looking for support, for backup, for anyone who would nod and agree that yes, this woman was clearly a problem. Instead, she found a dozen pairs of eyes watching her every move, some confused, some concerned, and at least 3 phones now recording her every word. Victoria's jaw tightened. She'd gone too far to back down now. In her world, backing down meant losing face, and losing face meant losing the power that came with her position. "Security has been called," she announced, her voice rising an octave. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Amara Richards took a slow sip of her sparkling water and set the glass down with the precision of a chess master, making her opening move. "Victoria," she said quietly, "this will be a moment you remember for the rest of your life." 3 hours earlier, Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday evening. The November rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the outside world into a gray blur of moving lights and rushing figures. Inside Terminal 3, however, the air was warm and filled with the familiar symphony of rolling luggage, boarding announcements, and 1,000 conversations in a dozen languages. "Doctor." Amara Richards stood in the Priority Pass lounge, a cup of black coffee in her hands and a weight on her shoulders that had nothing to do with her upcoming flight to Miami. She was dressed deliberately down black sweater, dark jeans, and comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. Her leather tote bag was worn at the edges, and she wore no jewelry except for a simple watch that looked like it came from a drugstore. The outfit was strategic. Today wasn't about making impressions or commanding rooms. Today was about observation. Amara was flying to Miami for an emergency board meeting at Skybridge Airlines, a company she'd quietly acquired a controlling interest in through a web of shell companies and investment funds. What the board didn't know was that their new majority shareholder was already among them, watching, learning, and taking notes on exactly how her investment was being managed. What she'd discovered so far hadn't been encouraging. Across the lounge, she watched a Skybridge flight attendant preparing for her shift. Victoria Cross stood in front of the women's restroom mirror, applying a fresh coat of lipstick with the precision of a surgeon. Her uniform was immaculate, tailored to perfection, and her platinum blonde hair caught the light like spun gold. Victoria was stunning, and she knew it. She also knew how to use it. Amara had been watching her for 20 minutes, observing how Victoria interacted with different passengers. With the elderly white businessman, she was deferential and charming. With the young white couple celebrating their anniversary, she was bubbly and accommodating. With the Hispanic family trying to navigate the complex boarding procedures, she was impatient and dismissive. The pattern was clear, consistent, and documented. Amara's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant legal team standing by. "Documentation ready. Are you sure about this approach?" She typed back quickly. "Sometimes you have to see the disease up close to cure it." At Gate B-22, the atmosphere was tense. Flight 847 to Miami was already delayed 30 minutes due to weather, and the gate area was packed with frustrated passengers checking their watches and sighing loudly. The gate agents, led by a tired-looking young woman named Elena Rodriguez, were doing their best to manage the crowd, but tensions were running high. Elena had been working for Skybridge for 3 years, and in that time she'd noticed things. Patterns. Behaviors that made her uncomfortable, but that she'd never felt empowered to address. She was Hispanic young and still paying off student loans. Speaking up about discrimination felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But watching Victoria Cross work the gate area was making her stomach turn. Group 1, First Class and Diamond Medallion members. "You are now welcomed aboard," Elena announced over the intercom, her voice professionally cheerful, despite the knot in her stomach. Victoria had positioned herself at the boarding bridge entrance like a sentinel. She was scanning the approaching passengers with the critical eye of a bouncer at an exclusive nightclub, mentally sorting them into categories: belongs, doesn't belong, needs watching. When Dr. Amara Richards approached the priority lane, her phone held out with the QR code bright on the screen. Victoria's entire demeanor shifted. "Hold on," Victoria said, stepping directly into Amara's path. The movement was deliberate, practiced a physical barrier disguised as customer service. Her voice was sweet as artificial honey, but the undertone was pure acid. "Can I check that boarding pass again, honey?" Amara paused, studying Victoria's face. "Is there a problem?" Victoria didn't look at the phone. Instead, her eyes traveled from Amara's worn sneakers to her simple sweater to her complete lack of designer accessories. The judgment was written across her beautiful features like graffiti on a wall. "Group 1 is for first class only," Victoria explained with exaggerated patience as if she were speaking to a child. "Economy boarding starts in about 20 minutes. You'll need to step aside and wait for your group." "I am in first class," Amara replied, her voice level and calm. "Seat 1A. Victoria's laugh was sharp and designed to humiliate. "Seat 1A. Honey, Seat 1A is our premium international first-class suite. That ticket costs $12,000. She leaned in closer, dropping her volume, but increasing the venom. "We've had a lot of upgrade clearances today. The computer system makes mistakes. Why don't you stand over there with the other economy passengers and I'll sort out your proper assignment when the rush is over." Behind Amara, the line was growing longer and more impatient. Bradley Pierce, the tech executive who had bumped into someone earlier in the lounge, was now directly behind her, his expensive Italian suit and obvious irritation radiating entitlement. "What's the holdup?" Bradley groaned loud enough to ensure everyone heard his frustration. "Come on, let's get this moving." Victoria's entire demeanor changed instantly, transforming from cold dismissal to warm accommodation. "Just a moment, sir." She beamed at Bradley, her smile so bright it could power the terminal. "Just sorting out a ticketing error with this passenger. We'll have you on board in no time." She turned back to Amara, her smile vanishing like a magic trick. "Move. Now." Elena Rodriguez watched the exchange from her position at the gate podium, her hands gripping her scanner so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd seen this before. She'd seen Victoria question passengers who didn't fit her mental image of first-class worthiness. She'd watched complaints get filed and mysteriously disappear. She'd witnessed discrimination disguised as policy enforcement, and she'd done nothing. But today felt different. Today there was something in the way the black woman held herself, something in the calm certainty of her voice that made Elena pay closer attention. She discreetly activated the gate's security camera recording function and angled it toward the boarding area. Just in case. Amara Richards took her phone and refreshed the boarding pass app. The QR code remained bright and clear. "It's not an error," she said simply. "Scan it again." "I don't need to scan anything to know you don't belong in one." Victoria snapped, her professional mask slipping completely. "We've been having problems with fraudulent tickets. Hackers, you know. Step aside or I'm calling security." In the boarding area, passengers were beginning to notice the commotion. Phones started emerging from pockets and purses. In 2024, public confrontations didn't happen in isolation anymore. They happened under the watchful eye of 1,000 cameras, and this one was about to go viral. The standoff at Gate B22 was drawing attention like a magnet draws metal filings. What had started as a private confrontation between Victoria Cross and Dr. Amara Richards was rapidly becoming a public spectacle, and everyone sensed that something significant was unfolding. "Scan the code," Amara said, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of the crowd. "If it's fraudulent, the machine will reject it. If it's legitimate, you're blocking a paying passenger from boarding her flight." Victoria's face flushed pink, a color that clashed dramatically with her platinum hair and red lipstick. She was trapped in a logic loop of her own making. Scanning the code would either prove Amara wrong, which would vindicate her, or prove Amara right, which would humiliate her in front of dozens of witnesses. Bradley Pierce, still standing directly behind Amara in line, let out an exaggerated sigh that could be heard 3 gates away. Lady, just move to economy where you belong. Some of us have connections to make. The comment landed like a slap. Several passengers visibly flinched. Rachel Thompson, the mother from Denver, felt something hot and angry rise in her chest. She'd heard that tone before. She'd seen that dismissive gesture. She knew exactly what was happening here. "Excuse me," Rachel said, stepping forward from her position in line. "Did you just tell her to move to economy where she belongs?" Based on what exactly, Bradley turned to face her, his expression annoyed at being questioned. Based on common sense. Look at her. Look around. Does she look like she belongs in first class? The question hung in the air like toxic smoke. Rachel felt her phone in her hand, recording app already open. Actually, she said, her voice carrying across the gate area, she looks like she belongs wherever she bought a ticket to sit. And right now, you look like someone who thinks money gives you the right to humiliate strangers. Victoria watched the exchange with growing alarm. This was spiraling beyond her control. She'd expected Amara to either back down quietly or explode in anger, giving her the excuse she needed to justify her actions. Instead, she was facing a woman who remained unnaturally calm and passengers who were actively taking sides. "This is a security issue," Victoria announced loudly, pulling out her phone and stepping back from the boarding scanner. "I'm calling airport police to escort this individual off the premises." Elena Rodriguez felt her heart sink. From her position at the gate podium, she could see everything unfolding, and she knew that calling security was the nuclear option. Once police were involved, the situation would escalate beyond anyone's ability to quietly resolve it. She also knew that Victoria's claim of a security threat was completely fabricated. "Wait," Elena called out, abandoning her post and approaching the group. "Victoria, maybe we should try scanning the pass first before calling." "Stay out of this." "Elena," Victoria snapped. "This is cabin crew authority. Return to your position." Elena stopped walking but didn't back down. "I'm gate crew. This is my gate. And I think we should verify the boarding pass before involving security." The crowd was growing larger. Word was spreading through the gate area that something dramatic was happening at the boarding door. Phones appeared like flowers after rain. Multiple passengers were now recording from different angles, and at least 2 had opened live streaming apps. Michael Ross, a 39-year-old business consultant from Atlanta, started a Facebook live stream that immediately attracted viewers. "Guys, you're not going to believe what I'm witnessing right now," he whispered into his phone. "Flight attendant versus passenger, and it's getting intense." Victoria grabbed the boarding scanner from Elena's hands, with enough force to make the younger woman stumble backward. Her movements were sharp, aggressive, designed to intimidate through physical presence. "Fine," Victoria hissed. "When this thing rejects your fake ticket, you're getting arrested for fraud." She aimed the scanner at Amara's phone with the aggression of someone pointing a weapon. The red laser light swept across the QR code. Beep beep. Green light. The scanner didn't just accept the boarding pass. It displayed a special prompt that Victoria had only seen a handful of times in her 5-year career: VIP, invitation only, greet by name. Victoria stared at the screen like it had just shown her a message in an alien language. The color drained from her face, then returned in a rush of embarrassed red. She looked from the scanner to Amara to the scanner again, her brain struggling to process information that didn't fit her worldview. "The system's glitched," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "These codes can be hacked." Amara Richards took a step closer to Victoria, close enough that only the flight attendant could hear her next words. "The system isn't glitched, Victoria. Your judgment is." Behind them, Bradley Pierce was growing more agitated by the moment. He'd been recording the confrontation on his phone, providing running commentary for his own amusement, but now he was beginning to sense that the situation wasn't unfolding the way he'd expected. "This is ridiculous," he announced to anyone who would listen. The pass scanned green. "Let her on the plane so the rest of us can board." But Victoria was too deep in to back out now. Her authority had been challenged in front of dozens of people. Her professional judgment had been questioned by subordinates. Her carefully constructed image of control was crumbling in real time. "Green light doesn't mean legitimate," she declared loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hackers are getting more sophisticated. I'm calling this in as a potential security breach." She pulled out her phone and dialed airport security. "This is Victoria Cross, Senior Flight Attendant on Skybridge 847. I need security at Gate B22 immediately. We have a passenger with suspicious documentation attempting to board with a potentially fraudulent first-class ticket." "Yes, I'll stay on the line." Rachel Thompson had heard enough. She stepped fully out of line and positioned herself next to Amara, a physical show of support that sent ripples through the crowd. "I'm recording this," she announced, holding up her phone. "This woman has done nothing wrong." Her ticket scanned green. She's been nothing but polite, and now she's being treated like a criminal for the crime of existing while black in first class. The accusation hit like a lightning strike. Suddenly, everyone in the gate area understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't about fraudulent tickets or security threats. This was about a black woman being denied service that she had legitimately purchased. "That's not true," Victoria protested, but her voice cracked under the weight of a dozen recording phones. "This is about safety and security, not race." Amara Richards remained standing exactly where she had been throughout the entire confrontation. She hadn't moved forward aggressively. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made any threatening gestures. She had simply stood her ground with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced this kind of treatment before and survived it. "Victoria," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent gate area in about 10 minutes, "you're going to understand exactly what kind of mistake you've made. But right now you still have a choice. You can end this with an apology, or you can continue down this path and discover just how expensive your assumptions are about to become." The warning was delivered with such calm certainty that several passengers actually shivered. Elena Rodriguez felt the hair on her arm stand up. Even Bradley Pierce stopped his muttering and stared at the woman in the simple black sweater. Victoria Cross, however, heard only defiance. She heard a challenge to her authority that demanded a response. She heard someone who thought they could threaten her on her own turf. "Security is on the way," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "We'll see who's making expensive mistakes." In the distance, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the terminal. 2 airport security officers were walking toward Gate B22, and with them came the point of no return. The confrontation was about to become something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The boarding process had resumed, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin of Flight 847 felt like the eye of a hurricane. Passengers filed into their seats with an unusual awareness, as if they knew they were walking into the aftermath of something significant. Dr. Amara Richards settled into seat 1A with the same calm precision she brought to everything else. She placed her worn leather tote in the overhead compartment, adjusted her seatbelt, and opened her Kindle to the page she'd been reading before the confrontation. To any observer, she appeared completely unaffected by the drama at the gate. But appearances could be deceiving. Victoria Cross moved through her pre-flight duties like a woman possessed. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a tight-lipped determination that made the other flight attendants nervous. She checked overhead bins with unnecessary force, arranged amenities with sharp, precise movements, and spoke to passengers in clipped professional tones that carried an undercurrent of barely controlled anger. In seat 2, B. Bradley Pierce was still filming intermittently, though his commentary had grown quieter after witnessing the gate confrontation. He'd expected to capture the removal of someone who didn't belong, but instead he'd documented a scene that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Still, he couldn't stop recording. The situation felt too volatile, too potentially explosive to ignore. Carlos Martinez, a 26-year-old flight attendant in his second year with Skybridge, watched Victoria's behavior with growing concern. He was supposed to be assisting her with first-class service, but every interaction felt like stepping through a minefield. Victoria's usual demanding personality had transformed into something harder, more dangerous. Carlos Victoria hissed as they prepared the beverage service. Keep an eye on 1A. Document anything unusual. Any excuse to call the captain. Carlos glanced toward Amara, who was quietly reading and occasionally sipping the sparkling water that Jessica, the junior flight attendant, had brought her. She seems fine. Just reading. She's plotting, Victoria insisted. People like that always are. The comment made Carlos's stomach turn. He'd heard Victoria make similar remarks before, always carefully worded, always deniable, but always carrying the same underlying message. He'd stayed quiet in the past, telling himself it wasn't his job to police his colleagues' attitudes. Today felt different. Rachel Thompson had chosen seat 3A specifically to stay close to the situation. As a mother, she'd developed a finely tuned sense for when adults were behaving badly, and Victoria Cross was triggering every instinct she had. She kept her phone easily accessible and made sure her recording app was ready to activate at a moment's notice. In seat 4B, an elderly businessman named Robert Hayes was trying to focus on his laptop, but the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. He'd flown first class hundreds of times over his 40-year career, and he'd never experienced an atmosphere like this. Flight attendants were supposed to make passengers feel comfortable, not like they were sitting on a powder keg. Captain David Bennett conducted his pre-flight checks with growing unease. His cabin crew had radioed about a passenger situation that had been resolved, but the reports he was getting from gate personnel told a different story. Elena Rodriguez had called him directly to express concerns about the boarding process, and he'd received 3 separate passenger complaints about his senior flight attendant's behavior. In his 15 years of flying, Bennett had learned that passenger complaints about crew behavior were often overblown or one-sided. But 3 independent reports describing similar incidents suggested a pattern that needed attention. Victoria appeared at the cockpit door, her smile bright and professional, but her eyes hard as diamonds. "Captain, I wanted to brief you on our first-class passenger manifest. We have an individual in 1A who may require additional monitoring during the flight." "What kind of monitoring?" Bennett asked, not looking up from his instruments. "She attempted to board with questionable documentation. We verified it at the gate, but there are still concerns about her intentions. I recommend keeping security on standby." Bennett turned to face his senior flight attendant. Victoria was one of his most experienced crew members, someone he'd worked with dozens of times. But something in her tone, something in the way she was presenting this information, felt off. What kind of questionable behavior has she exhibited since boarding? Victoria hesitated for just a moment. Nothing specific yet. "But in my experience, passengers who cause problems at the gate usually cause problems in flight. And what problems did she cause at the gate?" Another hesitation. She was difficult, argumentative, made accusations. Bennett made a mental note to review the gate incident reports before takeoff. Something about Victoria's story wasn't adding up, and he'd learned to trust his instincts about these things. Back in the cabin, Amara Richards continued reading, but she was also listening. Years of corporate negotiations had trained her to be aware of conversations happening around her, to pick up on subtle cues and undercurrents that revealed true intentions. She could hear Victoria's voice at the cockpit door, though not the specific words. She could see Bradley Pierce's periodic attempts to record her discreetly. She could feel the nervous energy radiating from Carlos Martinez and the protective concern coming from Rachel Thompson. Most importantly, she could sense that Victoria Cross was not going to let this situation rest. The flight attendant's pride had been wounded at the gate, and wounded pride in someone with power was a dangerous thing. Amara closed her Kindle and reached into her tote bag for her phone. She opened her messaging app and sent a quick text to her legal team. "Situation developing as expected. Continue monitoring all Skybridge communications. Legal action may be necessary." The response came back immediately. "Standing by. All documentation ready. Security footage from gate has been preserved." She put her phone away and reopened her book. In about 2 hours, Victoria Cross was going to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Amara could see it coming as clearly as she could see the weather outside the window. The only question was whether Victoria would choose to escalate or de-escalate. Based on everything Amara had observed so far, she was betting on escalation. As Flight 847 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, the pieces were falling into place for what would become one of the most documented incidents in airline history. Dr. Amara Richards sat in seat 1A, outwardly calm but inwardly preparing for what she knew was coming. Her phone buzzed with updates from her team in Miami. The emergency board meeting was still scheduled for the following morning, but her assistant had added an urgent note. Legal team recommends documenting all interactions. Pattern of discrimination complaints against crew member Victoria Cross found in company files. Amara typed back, "Continue building the file. I have a feeling we're going to need it." 3 rows behind her, Rachel Thompson was engaged in a quiet conversation with her seatmate, an environmental lawyer named David Kim, who had witnessed the gate confrontation. "I've never seen anything like that," he whispered. The flight attendant was looking for a reason to remove her from the beginning. It was textbook discrimination. Rachel replied, her voice low but certain. "And now we're trapped in an aluminum tube with both of them for the next 3 hours." Bradley Pierce had finally stopped recording and was scrolling through the footage on his phone. What had seemed entertaining at the gate now looked different in the stark cabin lighting. He was beginning to realize that his commentary and encouragement of Victoria's behavior had been captured, along with everything else. For the first time since the confrontation began, he was starting to worry about how his role in the incident might be perceived. Carlos Martinez was struggling with a crisis of conscience. He'd worked with Victoria for 8 months, and he'd seen her treat passengers differently based on their appearance, their clothing, their perceived social status. He'd told himself it was just her personality, her high standards, her dedication to maintaining the first-class experience. But watching her at the gate today, seeing the deliberate way she'd positioned herself to block a passenger's path, hearing the loaded language she'd used had shattered his ability to rationalize her behavior. Victoria Cross was in the galley ostensibly preparing for takeoff, but actually planning her next move. The passenger in 1A had humiliated her in front of dozens of people. She'd made Victoria look incompetent, unprofessional, possibly even discriminatory. That could not stand. Victoria had 5 years of experience with Skybridge Airlines, an exemplary service record, and the support of management. The woman in 1A was just another passenger who thought she could intimidate crew members with vague threats and implied consequences. Victoria was about to teach her exactly how wrong she was. Captain Bennett completed his final pre-flight checks and prepared for takeoff, unaware that his aircraft was carrying the ingredients for a perfect storm of pride, prejudice, and power that would forever change how airlines handled discrimination complaints. The flight was cleared for takeoff, and with it, the point of no return. 30 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, Victoria Cross began executing her plan. She'd spent the takeoff period watching Amara Richards, looking for any behavior that could be interpreted as disruptive, threatening, or inappropriate. What she found was a woman reading quietly, occasionally sipping water and responding politely to Jessica's service inquiries. It was maddeningly normal behavior that gave Victoria nothing to work with. So she decided to create something herself. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant speaking," Victoria announced over the cabin intercom, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone addressing a crisis. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our in-flight service systems. I'll need all passengers to remain seated while we resolve these issues." There were no technical difficulties. The announcement was pure fiction, designed to create an atmosphere of tension and concern that would make her next action seem reasonable. Victoria approached seat 1A with deliberate, measured steps. her movements designed to draw attention from every passenger in the first-class cabin. Carlos Martinez watched her approach with growing dread, recognizing the look of someone about to do something irreversible. "Ma'am," Victoria said loudly, positioning herself directly in front of Amara's seat. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the rear of the aircraft. We've received reports of disruptive behavior, and I need to conduct a security interview." Amara looked up from her Kindle, her expression calm and slightly confused. "Reports from whom I've been sitting here reading since takeoff. Multiple passengers have expressed concerns." Victoria lied smoothly. "Company policy requires me to investigate all security complaints immediately." Bradley Pierce, who had been dozing in seat 2B, was suddenly wide awake and reaching for his phone. This was exactly the kind of drama he'd been hoping for, and he started recording again, providing whispered commentary for his own amusement. "Now we're getting somewhere," he murmured into his phone. "Looks like airplane security is finally taking action." Rachel Thompson felt sick. She'd heard every word of the exchange, and she knew for a fact that no passengers had complained about Amara's behavior. If anything, the woman had been the most polite and quiet person in first class. "Excuse me," Rachel said, standing up from her seat despite the announcement about remaining seated. "I've been sitting 3 rows behind this lady since takeoff. She hasn't done anything disruptive. She's been reading the entire time." Victoria's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected passenger interference, and having her manufactured narrative challenged in real time was throwing off her carefully planned script. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Victoria ordered. "This is a crew matter that doesn't require passenger input." "Actually," said David Kim, the environmental lawyer sitting next to Rachel, "false accusations against passengers is definitely a passenger concern, especially when those accusations appear to be based on discriminatory profiling." The legal language hit Victoria like a slap. She spun to face David, her professional mask slipping to reveal the anger underneath. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop interfering with crew operations, or you'll be joining her in the back of the aircraft." Michael Ross, the business consultant who had live-streamed the gate confrontation, was now recording again on Facebook Live. His viewer count had jumped to over 300 people, with more joining every minute as word spread about the unfolding drama. "Folks, this is incredible," he whispered to his phone. "The flight attendant is now threatening passengers who are defending the woman from the gate. This is getting completely out of control." Carlos Martinez approached the situation from the galley, his conscience finally overriding his fear of confrontation. "Victoria," he said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this privately before Carlos returned to your duties immediately." Victoria snapped without turning around. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern him. And for the first time in his career, Carlos decided that doing the right thing was more important than avoiding conflict with a superior. Actually, he said loud enough for passengers to hear, "I've been monitoring this passenger since boarding. She hasn't exhibited any disruptive behavior. She ordered sparkling water, said please and thank you, and has been reading quietly for the entire flight." Victoria turned to face Carlos with an expression of pure betrayal. Her carefully constructed authority was crumbling in front of a cabin full of witnesses, and her own crew was contradicting her version of events. "Carlos, you're out of line," she hissed. "Return to the galley now, or you'll be written up for insubordination." Amara Richards had been watching the entire exchange with the fascination of someone observing a complex social experiment. She could see exactly what Victoria was trying to accomplish, could predict each escalation before it happened, and could anticipate the flight attendant's next moves with startling accuracy. "Victoria," Amara said, her voice cutting through the increasingly heated conversation, "you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. I'm happy to speak with you privately about whatever concerns you have, but creating a public scene is only going to make things worse for everyone involved." The offer was reasonable, de-escalating, and completely logical. It was exactly the kind of response that would have resolved the situation if resolution had been Victoria's goal. But resolution wasn't what Victoria wanted. She wanted vindication. She wanted to prove that her initial assessment of this passenger had been correct. She wanted to demonstrate her authority in a way that would discourage future challenges. Public scene. Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Ma'am, you created this scene the moment you tried to board with fraudulent documentation. Now you're going to face the consequences." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Every passenger in first class had heard Victoria explicitly accuse Amara of fraud, a federal crime that carried serious penalties. Rachel Thompson had heard enough. "That's a lie," she said, stepping into the aisle. Her boarding pass scanned green at the gate. "I saw it. Everyone saw it." "The scanner can be fooled," Victoria insisted. "Sophisticated fraud techniques." "Stop." Amara said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that made everyone pause. She closed her Kindle and stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Victoria, you've now accused me of federal fraud in front of dozens of witnesses. You've made false statements about passenger complaints. You've threatened other passengers for defending me, and you've ignored your own crew members' testimony about my behavior." She took a step closer to Victoria, close enough that their conversation couldn't be overheard by the entire cabin. "This is your last opportunity to step back from the edge," Amara said softly. "Because once you take the next step, there's no coming back from what's about to happen to your career." Victoria Cross looked into Amara Richards' eyes and saw something that made her blood run cold. Not fear, not anger, but certainty. The kind of certainty that came from holding cards nobody else knew existed. For just a moment, Victoria hesitated. Some primitive survival instinct was screaming at her to apologize, to back down, to find a graceful way out of the confrontation. But pride won. Pride and 5 years of getting her way, of having her authority respected, of never backing down from passengers who thought they could intimidate her. "Ma'am," Victoria said, raising her voice so the entire cabin could hear, "you're going to gather your belongings and move to the rear of the aircraft immediately, or I'm calling the captain to have you arrested upon landing." The threat was nuclear. Having a passenger arrested upon landing was the most serious action a flight attendant could threaten, reserved for genuine security threats and federal crimes. Amara Richards smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just watched their opponent make a fatal mistake. "Call the captain," she said simply. "I think he'll find this conversation very interesting." The cabin fell silent, except for the steady hum of the engines. Victoria Cross had just threatened to have a passenger arrested, and that passenger had responded by asking her to involve the captain. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented, but no one was quite sure what. Victoria's confidence flickered for just a moment. In her 5 years with Skybridge Airlines, she'd never had a passenger respond to the arrest threat with anything other than immediate compliance or explosive anger. This calm acceptance was something entirely outside her experience. "You want me to call the captain?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty disguised as disbelief. "Absolutely," Amara replied, settling back into her seat with the relaxed posture of someone who had just played a winning card. "I think Captain Bennett will be very interested to hear your version of events. Please make the call." Michael Ross was practically vibrating with excitement as he live-streamed the exchange. His viewer count had exploded to over 1,000 people, with comments streaming by faster than he could read them. The hashtag #SkyBridgeShame was starting to trend on multiple platforms. "Folks, this is absolutely insane," he whispered to his phone. The passenger just told the flight attendant to call the captain. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like she wants this to escalate." Bradley Pierce had stopped recording and was now frantically scrolling through his earlier footage, trying to delete the parts where he'd encouraged Victoria's behavior. The growing audience and increasingly serious tone of the confrontation was making him realize that he might have recorded evidence of his own complicity in discrimination. Victoria picked up the cabin phone and dialed the cockpit, her hand shaking slightly as she punched in the extension numbers. "Captain Bennett, this is Victoria. I need you in the first-class cabin immediately. We have a passenger situation that requires your authority." What kind of situation? Bennett's voice came through clearly enough that several passengers could hear it. "The individual in seat 1A is refusing to comply with crew instructions. She's being disruptive and may pose a security threat. I'm recommending immediate intervention." There was a pause on the line. "Has she made any threatening statements or gestures?" Victoria hesitated. "Not exactly threatening, but she's being non-compliant and argumentative." "I'll be right there," Bennett said, but his tone suggested skepticism rather than urgency. While they waited for the captain, Carlos Martinez made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He approached Rachel Thompson and David Kim, speaking quietly but urgently. "I need you both to know something," he said. "I've been working with Victoria for 8 months. What you're seeing today isn't unusual. She treats passengers differently based on how they look, how they dress, how much money she thinks they have." Rachel felt her stomach turn. "How often does this happen?" "More than you'd think. Usually passengers just comply rather than fight it. They move seats, they accept downgrades, they file complaints that disappear. But this woman," he glanced toward Amara, "she's not backing down." David Kim, the environmental lawyer, was taking notes on his phone. "Are you willing to testify about this pattern of behavior?" Carlos nodded, his jaw set with determination. "If it comes to that, yes. This has gone too far." Captain Bennett emerged from the cockpit and walked into the first-class cabin, his presence immediately changing the energy of the space. At 48 years old, he commanded respect through competence rather than authority, and his arrival made everyone straighten unconsciously. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, directing the question to Victoria, but looking around the cabin to assess the overall situation. "Captain, the passenger in 1A has been disruptive since boarding." Victoria began launching into her rehearsed narrative. She attempted to board with questionable documentation, became argumentative when questioned, and is now refusing to follow crew instructions. Bennett turned to look at Amara, who was sitting calmly in her seat, Kindle in her lap, no signs of agitation or aggressive behavior visible. "Ma'am, can you tell me your version of events?" Amara stood up respectfully, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Captain, I boarded with a legitimate first-class ticket that scanned green at the gate. Since takeoff, I've been reading quietly and responding politely to service requests. I haven't raised my voice, made any demands, or exhibited any disruptive behavior." She paused, looking directly at Bennett. "However, your flight attendant has now falsely accused me of fraud, threatened me with arrest, and created a disturbance that has involved multiple passengers and crew members." Bennett looked around the cabin, noting the numerous phones recording the interaction, the tense body language of passengers, and the obvious division between those supporting Amara and those remaining silent. "Are there any witnesses to these events?" he asked. Rachel Thompson stood up immediately. "Captain, I was 3 rows behind this lady during the entire flight. She's been completely quiet and polite. The flight attendant initiated this confrontation with false accusations." David Kim joined her. "I witnessed the gate incident as well. The passenger's documentation was validated by the scanner, but the flight attendant continued to question its legitimacy based on what appeared to be discriminatory profiling." Carlos Martinez took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Captain, I've been observing this passenger since boarding. She hasn't exhibited any disruptive behavior. The accusations are not supported by evidence." Bennett felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. 3 independent witnesses contradicting his senior flight attendant's version of events suggested serious problems that went beyond a simple passenger dispute. Victoria watched her narrative crumble in real time, her face cycling through expressions of shock, betrayal, and growing panic. "Captain, they're lying. This passenger has been problematic from the beginning. Ask anyone who actually interrupted Michael Ross still live streaming. I've been recording this entire flight. Everything that's happened is documented." He pointed at Amara, has been nothing but polite. The accusations are completely fabricated. The word recording hit Victoria like a physical blow. In the age of social media, there was no such thing as private discrimination. Every action, every statement, every decision was potentially being documented for posterity. Bennett realized he was facing a situation that could destroy careers, generate lawsuits, and create a public relations nightmare for Skybridge Airlines. Every instinct told him to de-escalate, investigate, and find a solution that didn't involve federal authorities. "Victoria," he said carefully, "I'd like to speak with you privately in the galley." Captain Amara interjected gently, "Before you do that, I think there's something you should know about me." Everyone in the cabin turned to look at her. There was something in her tone, something in the way she held herself that suggested the conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. "I'm not just a passenger on this flight," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I'm also the majority shareholder of Skybridge Airlines." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the hum of the engines and the collective intake of breath from a dozen passengers. Victoria Cross felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The revelation hit the first-class cabin like a lightning strike. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The woman that Victoria Cross had been harassing, threatening, and falsely accusing of fraud was the owner of the airline. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally pure terror. The color drained from her face so completely that her red lipstick looked like a wound against pale skin. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice lacked any conviction. Deep down, she was beginning to understand that the calm confidence Amara had displayed throughout the confrontation suddenly made perfect sense. Captain Bennett felt his career flash before his eyes. As the pilot in command, he was ultimately responsible for everything that happened on his aircraft. A discrimination incident involving the airline's owner was the kind of career-ending nightmare that pilots woke up in cold sweats dreaming about. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "can you provide verification of that claim?" Amara reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone. She opened an app and handed the device to Bennett. On the screen was a corporate ownership dashboard showing Meridian Capital's 67% controlling stake in Skybridge Airlines, with Dr. Amara Richards listed as managing partner. Bennett stared at the screen, his pilot training warring with the urge to panic. He'd just witnessed his senior flight attendant systematically discriminate against and threaten the person who ultimately signed his paychecks. The live stream viewers were exploding in real time. Michael Ross's feed had jumped to over 5,000 viewers, with comments streaming by so fast they were unreadable. The hashtag #SkybridgeShame was now trending nationwide, and major news outlets were starting to pick up the story. "Holy shit," Michael whispered into his phone, forgetting to censor himself. "The passenger owns the airline. The flight attendant just discriminated against her own boss." Victoria Cross was experiencing what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Her brain simply could not process the information that the woman she'd spent 2 hours demonizing was actually the most powerful person in the company hierarchy. "This is a trick," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "Some kind of scam. People can fake anything on phones these days." But even as she spoke, Victoria was remembering details that now took on sinister significance. The invitation-only status on Amara's boarding pass. The VIP designation that appeared when it scanned. The mysterious phone calls about board meetings and legal teams. Carlos Martinez felt a mixture of vindication and terror. He'd been right about Victoria's discriminatory behavior, but he'd also just witnessed his colleague threaten to have the airline's owner arrested. The potential consequences were staggering. Rachel Thompson was recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking with adrenaline. As a mother, she'd taught her children about standing up to bullies, and she was watching the ultimate bully-victim reversal play out in real time. Captain Amara said, her voice still calm despite the chaos around her. "I think we need to address the fact that your flight attendant just threatened to have me arrested for the crime of flying on my own airline while black." The racial component hit like a second lightning strike. What had been a personnel issue was now a civil rights incident with potential federal implications. Bennett could see his career, Victoria's career, and possibly the airline's reputation disappearing in real time. "Ma'am, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," Bennett began. "No misunderstanding," Amara interrupted gently. "Your flight attendant saw a black woman in first class and decided I didn't belong there. She questioned my documentation, accused me of fraud, threatened me with arrest, and created a disturbance that disrupted the entire cabin. All because I committed the crime of existing in a space she thought was reserved for people who looked different than me." Victoria was spiraling. The rational part of her brain understood that she needed to apologize, grovel, and hope that somehow this nightmare could be contained. But the prideful part, the part that had gotten her into this situation, was still fighting. "I was doing my job," she protested. "Ensuring passenger safety and preventing fraud. Race had nothing to do with it." "Really?" Amara asked, her tone conversational. "Then why didn't you question the documentation of the white man behind me who boarded with the same green light? Why didn't you investigate the multiple white passengers who looked too casual for first class? Why was I the only person whose ticket you declared fraudulent, despite clear evidence to the contrary?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Everyone in the cabin could see the pattern now that it had been spelled out for them. Bradley Pierce was frantically deleting his social media posts from the gate incident, but he knew it was too late. Screenshots lived forever on the internet, and his enthusiastic support of Victoria's discriminatory behavior was permanently documented. Bennett made a command decision. As pilot in command, he had the authority to remove disruptive crew members, and Victoria had clearly become a threat to flight safety and airline operations. "Victoria," he said formally, "you're relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Please return to the crew rest area." "You can't do this," Victoria protested. "I have seniority. I have rights. This passenger is lying about Victoria Bennett's voice carried the steel of command authority. You have 3 seconds to comply with my direct order, or I'll be forced to have you physically restrained." The threat was real and immediate. Disobeying a direct order from the pilot in command was grounds for federal prosecution, and Victoria finally understood that she had no allies left in the situation. But instead of backing down gracefully, Victoria made the decision that would seal her fate permanently. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "This is Victoria Cross, Senior Flight Attendant on Skybridge Airlines Flight 847, she said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I need police to meet this aircraft upon landing. We have a passenger who has made terrorist threats and claimed to own the airline. I believe she may be mentally disturbed and potentially dangerous." The false police report was the final nail in her coffin. Filing a fraudulent emergency report was a federal crime, and she'd just committed it in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple recording devices. Amara Richards watched Victoria make the call with the fascination of someone observing a complex self-destruction. She'd seen this pattern before in corporate settings. Pride leading to poor decisions. Poor decisions leading to desperation. And desperation leading to actions that made everything exponentially worse. "Captain," she said quietly, "I think you'd better contact your legal department. This situation is about to become much more complicated." The false 911 call had triggered a cascade of consequences that reached far beyond Flight 847. Within minutes, federal authorities were coordinating with airport security. Skybridge's corporate legal team was activating emergency protocols, and social media was exploding with real-time coverage of what was being called the airline incident of the decade. Captain Bennett felt the weight of command responsibility crushing down on him. He'd been flying for 15 years, and he'd never faced a situation where a crew member had filed a false police report against a passenger who turned out to be the airline's owner. The training manuals didn't cover this scenario. "I need to make some calls," he told Amara, his voice heavy with the knowledge that the next few conversations would determine the trajectory of multiple careers. "Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry about what's happened here today." "Don't apologize yet," Captain Amara replied gently. "We need to document everything properly first. This isn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. This is about company culture, training protocols, and widespread practices that need addressing." Carlos Martinez had moved to the galley area where Victoria was making increasingly frantic phone calls to union representatives and friends in management. He could hear fragments of her conversations, and each one made the situation worse. "Tell them she's lying." Victoria was hissing into her phone. "Find something on her. People like that always have secrets. They have to believe me over some random passenger." The "people like that" comment was overheard by several passengers and added another layer to the discrimination case building against her. Michael Ross's live stream had become appointment viewing. His viewer count had reached 15,000 people, with major news outlets and social media influencers sharing the feed. The comment section was a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. "Folks, this is unprecedented," he whispered to his camera. "I've been documenting this entire incident, and it just keeps getting worse. The flight attendant has now filed a false police report against the airline's owner. I can't even imagine the legal consequences." Rachel Thompson was coordinating with other passengers to ensure that multiple angles of the incident were being documented. David Kim, the environmental lawyer, was taking detailed notes about potential federal civil rights violations, while several other passengers were uploading their recordings to cloud storage to preserve evidence. "This isn't just about one bad employee," Rachel said to David. "This is about a culture that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. How many other passengers have been treated this way without the resources to fight back?" The question was more prescient than she realized. While the drama unfolded at 35,000 feet, Skybridge's corporate offices were conducting emergency reviews of passenger complaints involving Victoria Cross. What they found was disturbing. Elena Rodriguez, the gate agent who had witnessed the initial confrontation, was being interviewed by corporate security. Her testimony revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been reported multiple times but never seriously investigated. She questioned Black and Hispanic passengers more frequently, Elena explained to the investigators. She'd make comments about how certain people didn't look right for first class. Management knew about the complaints, but they always got filed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. The corporate investigation was revealing deeper problems. Victoria's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of discrimination that had been systematically ignored or minimized by supervisors who prioritized crew morale over passenger rights. Back on the aircraft, Amara was fielding calls from her legal team, who were monitoring the situation in real time and coordinating with federal authorities to ensure that all evidence was properly preserved. "Dr. Richards," her attorney's voice came through clearly on her phone. "We've already received calls from 3 major news networks. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division is taking an interest. This is going to be a significant case." "Good," Amara replied. "Make sure everything is documented properly. This isn't about revenge. This is about preventing this from happening to other passengers who don't have the resources to fight back." Victoria Cross was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown. The reality of her situation was finally penetrating her denial, and she was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistakes. She'd discriminated against the airline's owner, filed a false police report, and done it all in front of multiple recording devices. Her calls to union representatives were revealing the harsh truth that even the strongest employment protections couldn't save her from federal criminal charges for filing a false emergency report. "You need to get a criminal attorney," her union rep told her bluntly. "This isn't an employment issue anymore. This is potentially a federal case." Captain Bennett was in the cockpit coordinating with air traffic control corporate headquarters and federal authorities. The airline's crisis management team was already mobilizing, and legal teams were preparing for what could be a landmark discrimination lawsuit. "Flight 847, this is corporate dispatch," came the voice over the radio. "We need a full incident report immediately upon landing. FBI and DOJ representatives will be meeting the aircraft." The federal involvement raised the stakes exponentially. What had started as a personnel dispute was now a potential civil rights violation with criminal elements. Carlos Martinez made a decision that would define his integrity for the rest of his career. He approached Amara with a written statement detailing every instance of discriminatory behavior he'd witnessed from Victoria over the past 8 months. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I should have spoken up sooner. I watched her treat passengers differently based on their race, their appearance, their perceived social status. I told myself it wasn't my job to police her behavior, but I was wrong." Amara read through Carlos's statement, noting the detailed descriptions of incidents that revealed a clear pattern of discriminatory conduct. "Thank you for finding the courage to speak up. That couldn't have been easy." "It should have been easier," Carlos replied, "and it should have happened sooner." The conversation was overheard by several passengers who began sharing their own observations about airline discrimination. The incident was becoming a catalyst for broader conversations about racial bias in the travel industry. Bradley Pierce had gone completely silent, hunched over his phone, desperately trying to limit the damage from his own recorded comments supporting Victoria's behavior. His business colleagues were already calling with concerns about his conduct, and he was beginning to realize that his career might be collateral damage in Victoria's meltdown. As the aircraft continued toward Miami, the scope of the incident was expanding beyond anything anyone had imagined. What had started as one flight attendant's discriminatory behavior was revealing deep-seated cultural problems that reached throughout the airline industry. Amara Richards sat quietly in seat 1, reading her Kindle and occasionally taking calls from attorneys, board members, and federal investigators. She'd experienced discrimination many times throughout her career, but this was the first time she'd been in a position to do something about it on an institutional level. The real reckoning was still to come. As word of the incident spread through the airline's corporate hierarchy, the true scope of Dr. Amara Richards' influence began to emerge. What passengers and crew had initially seen as a wealthy businesswoman was revealing itself as something far more significant. In the Skybridge Airlines corporate headquarters in Atlanta, emergency meetings were convening at every level. The airline's CEO, Marcus Webb, was pacing his office while fielding calls from board members, federal regulators, and crisis management consultants. "Sir," his assistant interrupted urgently, "we've confirmed the passenger's identity. Dr. Amara Richards is the managing partner of Meridian Capital, which owns 67% of our stock through various investment vehicles. She's not just a shareholder, she's effectively our boss." Webb felt the blood drain from his face. He'd been preparing to manage a discrimination lawsuit, but now he was facing the possibility that the airline's owner had been systematically mistreated by his own employees. "Get me the complete file on flight attendant Victoria Cross," he ordered. "I want every complaint, every incident report, every performance review from the past 5 years. And get our legal team on the phone immediately." Meanwhile, the live stream audiences were conducting their own investigations. Social media users were digging into Meridian Capital's investment portfolio, discovering that Dr. Richards controlled significant stakes in dozens of major corporations across multiple industries. "Guys, this is insane," Michael Ross whispered to his viewers, who now numbered over 20,000. I'm looking at her company's website. Meridian Capital manages over $15 billion in assets. This woman doesn't just own Skybridge Airlines. She owns pieces of half the Fortune 500. The revelation was adding layers of significance to the incident. This wasn't just discrimination against a passenger. It was discrimination against one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. Victoria Cross was in the crew rest area frantically researching Meridian Capital on her phone. With each website, she visited each news article. She read each corporate disclosure. She discovered the magnitude of her mistake became clearer. Dr. Amara Richards wasn't just wealthy. She was influential in ways that could reshape entire industries. Her investment decisions could make or break companies. Her public statements could move stock prices. Her endorsement or condemnation of business practices could influence corporate behavior across multiple sectors. And Victoria had just spent 2 hours treating her like a criminal. "This can't be happening," Victoria whispered to herself, scrolling through news articles about Meridian Capital's recent acquisitions. "This has to be some kind of setup, some kind of trap." But the evidence was overwhelming. Corporate documents didn't lie, and the SEC filings clearly showed Dr. Richards' control of the investment funds that owned Skybridge Airlines. Carlos Martinez was experiencing his own revelation. As he processed what he'd learned about Amara's true identity, he began to understand the broader implications of the airline industry's discriminatory practices. She could have flown private, he said to Rachel Thompson, who had struck up a conversation with him during the chaos. She has enough money to own her own jet fleet. But she chose to fly commercial dressed down, experiencing the same treatment as regular passengers. "Why would she do that?" Rachel asked. To see how the company really operates, Carlos realized. To experience firsthand how employees treat people when they think nobody important is watching. The insight was spreading through the cabin as passengers began to understand that they'd witnessed something unprecedented, a business leader conducting an undercover investigation of her own company's culture. David Kim, the environmental lawyer, was taking notes about the broader legal implications. "This creates a fascinating precedent," he explained to other passengers. She wasn't just a victim of discrimination. She was a CEO conducting due diligence who discovered discriminatory practices through direct experience. The distinction was significant. Courts and regulators viewed discrimination against business leaders differently than discrimination against ordinary passengers, especially when that discrimination revealed company-wide cultural problems. Bradley Pierce was learning the same lessons, but from a much more uncomfortable perspective. His social media posts supporting Victoria's behavior weren't just evidence of poor judgment. They were evidence of complicity with discrimination against one of the business community's most powerful figures. His phone was buzzing with calls from colleagues, clients, and supervisors who had seen his posts before he'd deleted them. The tech industry was a small world, and word was spreading quickly about his role in the incident. Captain Bennett was getting updates from corporate headquarters that painted an increasingly dire picture. The FBI's Civil Rights Division was opening a preliminary investigation. The Department of Transportation was reviewing Skybridge's passenger treatment protocols. Congressional representatives were already scheduling hearings about discrimination in the airline industry. "Captain," came the voice over the radio, "this is the highest priority incident in company history. Federal authorities are treating this as a potential pattern of civil rights violations with criminal elements." The scope was expanding beyond anything Bennett had experienced in his career. What had started as a routine flight was becoming a watershed moment for the airline industry's approach to passenger rights. Amara Richards was fielding calls from attorneys, board members, and federal investigators, but she was also thinking strategically about the opportunity this incident represented. Discrimination in airlines wasn't new, but having it documented so thoroughly with such clear evidence and such widespread public attention created a chance to drive meaningful change. "This isn't about punishment," she told her legal team during one call. This is about transformation. We have an opportunity to set new standards for the entire industry. As the aircraft approached Miami, everyone on board understood that they were no longer just passengers on a routine flight. They were witnesses to a moment that would define how companies addressed discrimination, how employees treated customers, and how powerful individuals used their influence to drive social change. The real confrontation was still ahead. Miami International Airport had become the center of a media storm. News vans lined the perimeter roads, reporters positioned themselves at strategic locations, and federal agents coordinated with local police to manage what had become the most high-profile airline incident in years. As Flight 847 taxied to its gate, the aircraft was surrounded by more law enforcement than most passengers had ever seen in one place. FBI agents, airport police, federal marshals, and airline security formed a coordinated response team that made the situation look like a scene from a crime thriller. Inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. Victoria Cross had barricaded herself in the crew rest area, refusing to speak to anyone except through her hastily acquired attorney. Her false 911 call had triggered the massive law enforcement response, and she was beginning to understand that federal charges were inevitable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Bennett announced over the intercom, "we've arrived at our gate in Miami. Due to an ongoing investigation, we ask that all passengers remain seated until federal authorities can board the aircraft and conduct their interviews." The announcement sent a chill through the cabin. Most passengers had signed up for a routine flight to Miami, not a federal investigation with potential criminal charges. Dr. Amara Richards sat calmly in seat 1A, checking messages from her legal team and preparing for what she knew would be hours of interviews, depositions, and testimony. Her phone buzzed with updates from corporate headquarters, where emergency board meetings were restructuring company policies in real time. Dr. Richards came a text from her assistant. "Major news networks are requesting interviews. Congressional representatives are calling for hearings. The stock market is reacting to the story. How do you want to handle media requests?" She typed back, "No interviews until the investigation is complete. This is about justice, not publicity." The first federal agents to board the aircraft were from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They moved with the professional efficiency of people who had handled discrimination cases before, but their presence underscored the seriousness of the situation. Dr. Richards, the lead agent, approached her seat. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We'd like to speak with you about the incident that occurred on this flight." "Of course," Amara replied, standing up with the same calm dignity she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "I have documentation from my legal team, witness statements from passengers and crew, and recordings of the entire incident." Agent Chen nodded approvingly. "Thorough documentation is helpful. We understand this involves allegations of discrimination and a false police report." "That's correct. Your investigation will find a pattern of discriminatory behavior that extends beyond today's incident." As Amara was escorted off the aircraft for her interview, the remaining passengers watched through the windows as the media circus outside reached new levels of intensity. Reporters were broadcasting live updates, and the hashtag #SkyBridgeShame was trending worldwide. Carlos Martinez was interviewed next, his detailed statement about Victoria's pattern of discriminatory behavior providing crucial evidence for the federal investigation. His courage in speaking up was already being hailed by civil rights organizations as an example of how employees could help combat workplace discrimination. "Mr. Martinez," Agent Chen said during his interview, "your testimony suggests this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern." "Can you provide specific examples?" Carlos had prepared for this question, and his response was devastating to Victoria's defense. "Over the past 8 months, I documented 13 separate instances where she treated passengers differently based on their race appearance or perceived social status. I have dates, flight numbers, and witness observations." Rachel Thompson's interview focused on her role as a passenger witness, but her testimony about the deliberate nature of Victoria's discriminatory behavior added weight to the criminal case. She wasn't just rude or unprofessional, Rachel explained. She was systematically targeting a passenger based on racial assumptions. When other passengers defended Dr. Richards, the flight attendant threatened them too. The interviews continued for hours, with each witness statement building a comprehensive case that extended far beyond the immediate incident. Federal investigators were uncovering evidence of institutional discrimination that had been ignored or covered up by airline management for years. Bradley Pierce's interview was particularly uncomfortable as agents questioned him about his social media posts supporting Victoria's discriminatory behavior. His recorded comments encouraging the flight attendant's actions had made him a potential co-conspirator in the civil rights violation. Mr. Pierce Agent Chen said, reviewing his deleted social media posts that had been preserved by investigators, "Your statements appear to show active support for discriminatory treatment of Dr. Richards. Can you explain your reasoning?" Bradley's attorney advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights, but the damage to his reputation was already done. His company had placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Victoria Cross's interview took place in a secure room with her attorney present, but her statements only made her legal situation worse. She continued to insist that her actions were based on security concerns rather than racial bias, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "My client maintains that she was following standard airline security protocols," her attorney stated. "Any appearance of discriminatory treatment was unintentional and based on legitimate safety concerns." Agent Chen reviewed the evidence collected from the flight. "Your client questioned a passenger whose boarding pass scanned successfully, accused her of fraud without evidence, threatened her with arrest, and then filed a false police report when confronted with contradictory evidence. These actions establish a clear pattern of discriminatory intent. The federal investigation was moving quickly, with agents working around the clock to build a comprehensive case. The high-profile nature of the incident and the clear documentation of discriminatory behavior made it a priority for the Civil Rights Division. Outside the airport, protesters had gathered to show support for Dr. Richards and demand accountability from Skybridge Airlines. The incident had become a symbol of broader discrimination issues in the travel industry, and civil rights organizations were using it to push for legislative changes. As the sun set over Miami, the full scope of the consequences was beginning to emerge. Victoria Cross faced federal charges for filing a false police report and potential civil rights violations. Skybridge Airlines was under investigation for institutional discrimination. And Dr. Amara Richards had become an unexpected symbol of how powerful individuals could use their influence to fight injustice. The investigation was just beginning, but the transformation it would trigger was already unstoppable. The Skybridge Airlines corporate headquarters in Atlanta was in full crisis mode. Every conference room was filled with lawyers, executives, and crisis management consultants working through the night to address what was rapidly becoming the airline industry's most significant discrimination scandal in decades. CEO Marcus Webb stood before an emergency board meeting, his face grave as he delivered updates that seemed to get worse with each passing hour. The FBI has confirmed that Dr. Amara Richards, through Meridian Capital, controls 67% of our stock, he announced to the room full of executives. "She's not just our largest shareholder, she's our effective owner, and our employees just subjected her to systematic racial discrimination in front of hundreds of witnesses." The board members sat in stunned silence. The financial implications alone were staggering, but the legal and reputational consequences could destroy the company entirely. "How extensive is the discrimination?" asked board member Jennifer Walsh, her voice tight with concern. Webb consulted his notes, each page representing another nail in the company's coffin. Preliminary investigation shows that flight attendant Victoria Cross had 47 documented complaints over 5 years. 38 of those complaints came from passengers of color. All of them were dismissed as personality conflicts or misunderstandings. The pattern was damning. It revealed not just individual discrimination but institutional negligence that had allowed discriminatory behavior to flourish unchecked. "What's our legal exposure?" asked another board member. According to our attorneys, Webb replied, "We're looking at potential federal civil rights violations, pattern discrimination lawsuits, shareholder litigation, regulatory sanctions, and criminal charges against multiple employees." The DOJ is treating this as a priority case. Meanwhile, in Miami, Dr. Amara Richards was conducting her own board meeting via secure video conference from her hotel suite. The Meridian Capital legal team had assembled overnight to coordinate the response to what they were calling the airline discrimination case of the century. Dr. Richards, her lead attorney, said over the video call, "We have enough evidence for multiple federal lawsuits. The discrimination was systematic, well-documented, and occurred in front of dozens of witnesses. We could pursue damages in the hundreds of millions." Amara looked thoughtful as she reviewed the evidence files spread across her hotel room table. Damages aren't the goal here. Transformation is. I want to know what it will take to completely restructure how this industry treats passengers. "That's going to require more than litigation," replied her civil rights attorney. "We'll need federal oversight, mandatory training programs, independent monitoring, and transparent complaint processes. Essentially, we'll need to rebuild the airline's culture from the ground up." "Then that's what we'll do," Amara said simply. "Money is just a tool. Let's use it to create change that protects future passengers." The media coverage was reaching unprecedented levels. Every major news network was leading with the story, and social media was exploding with discussions about discrimination in the airline industry. The hashtag #SkyBridgeShame had generated over 1 million posts, with passengers sharing their own experiences of discriminatory treatment. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Airline owner discriminated against on own plane." Fox News was running continuous coverage under the headline, "Billionaire CEO faces racial profiling at 35,000 feet." MSNBC had assembled a panel of civil rights experts discussing the broader implications for airline regulation. The incident was becoming a catalyst for national conversations about discrimination, corporate responsibility, and the power of documentation in the social media age. Victoria Cross was experiencing the complete collapse of her life. Her attorney had informed her that federal prosecutors were planning to charge her with filing a false police report, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deprive someone of their constitutional rights. Each charge carried potential prison time. Her apartment was surrounded by reporters. Her social media accounts were flooded with condemnations. Her union had distanced itself from her actions, and her family was receiving threats from strangers who had seen the viral videos of her discriminatory behavior. "My client was simply following airline security protocols," her attorney stated to reporters outside the federal courthouse. She had no knowledge of the passenger's identity or business relationships. But the statement rang hollow in light of the evidence. Victoria's pattern of discriminatory behavior, her escalation tactics, and her false police report created a narrative of deliberate bias that no amount of legal spin could overcome. Carlos Martinez had become an unexpected hero. His courage in speaking up against Victoria's discriminatory behavior was being praised by civil rights organizations, airline industry reformers, and workplace advocacy groups. "Mr. Martinez represents the best of corporate America," said Dr. Angela Foster, director of the National Civil Rights Institute. "He saw injustice and found the courage to speak truth to power even when it put his own job at risk." Skybridge Airlines had announced his immediate promotion to passenger advocate, a new position created specifically to monitor and prevent discriminatory behavior. Other airlines were already reaching out to hire him, recognizing that his moral courage made him valuable in an industry struggling with discrimination issues. Bradley Pierce's life was unraveling in parallel with Victoria's. His company had terminated his employment after his social media posts supporting discriminatory behavior went viral. His professional reputation was destroyed, and he was facing potential civil liability for his role in encouraging Victoria's actions. "I made a mistake," he said in a brief statement to reporters. "I allowed my biases to cloud my judgment, and I supported behavior that was clearly wrong. I take full responsibility for my actions." The apology was too little too late. In the social media age, there was no taking back recorded statements that revealed someone's true character under pressure. Rachel Thompson had become a sought-after spokesperson for passenger rights organizations. Her quick thinking in recording Victoria's discriminatory behavior and her courage in speaking up for Dr. Richards had made her a symbol of how ordinary people could combat injustice. "We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see discrimination," she said in interviews. "Staying silent makes us complicit in perpetuating systems that harm innocent people." The federal investigation was revealing the depth of Skybridge's problems. Victoria Cross wasn't the only employee with a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The company's training programs were inadequate. Its complaint processes were designed to protect employees rather than passengers, and its corporate culture had normalized treating passengers differently based on their appearance and perceived social status. "This isn't about one bad employee," FBI agent Sarah Chen told reporters. "This is about institutional failures that created an environment where discrimination could flourish unchecked." As the investigation continued, more passengers came forward with their own experiences of discriminatory treatment by Skybridge Airlines. The incident had opened floodgates of testimony about widespread bias that had been hidden or ignored for years. Dr. Amara Richards watched the coverage from her hotel room feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because the incident was driving meaningful change in an industry that needed it. Sadness because it had taken her unique position of power to force accountability for behavior that should have been unacceptable regardless of the victim's identity. "Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect," she said in her first public statement. "This incident happened to me because I was in a position to document it and fight back. But it happens to countless others who don't have those resources. That's what we're really fighting to change." The transformation was already beginning, but the real work lay ahead. Within 48 hours of Flight 847's landing, the consequences of Victoria Cross's discriminatory behavior were reverberating through every level of the airline industry. What had started as one flight attendant's bias had triggered a chain reaction that was reshaping corporate policies, federal regulations, and public expectations across the aviation sector. Victoria Cross was arrested at her apartment in Atlanta on federal charges of filing a false police report, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deprive an individual of constitutional rights. The FBI agents who took her into custody found her packing to leave the country, an action that added flight risk to her growing list of legal problems. Ms. Cross is facing up to 15 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges, announced U.S. Attorney Patricia Martinez at a press conference outside the federal courthouse. The Department of Justice takes civil rights violations seriously, especially when they involve systematic discrimination and false reporting to law enforcement. The visual of Victoria being led away in handcuffs became one of the defining images of the incident, shared millions of times across social media platforms as a symbol of accountability for discriminatory behavior. Skybridge Airline's stock price had dropped 23% since the incident became public, wiping out nearly $2 billion in market value. The company's crisis management team was working around the clock to prevent a complete corporate collapse. CEO Marcus Webb announced sweeping changes during an emergency press conference. Effective immediately, Skybridge Airlines is implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, establishing an independent passenger advocate office, and creating transparent complaint processes with third-party oversight. But the changes went deeper than policy adjustments. Webb also announced that he was stepping down as CEO, accepting responsibility for the institutional failures that had allowed discriminatory behavior to flourish under his leadership. "I failed to create a culture of equality and respect," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "The buck stops with me, and I'm taking full accountability for these failures." Dr. Amara Richards was named interim CEO, making her the first black woman to lead a major airline. Her appointment was met with widespread support from civil rights organizations and business leaders who saw her as uniquely qualified to rebuild the company's culture. Dr. Richards brings not only business expertise but lived experience with the discrimination our industry needs to address, said Senator Elizabeth Warren in a statement supporting the appointment. She has the credibility and capability to drive real change. Carlos Martinez's transformation from conflicted employee to moral leader was being celebrated across multiple industries. His courage in speaking up against discriminatory behavior despite personal risk had made him a case study in workplace ethics programs. Mr. Martinez demonstrated that doing the right thing requires courage, but that courage can create change that protects countless others, said Dr. Martin Foster, director of the Corporate Ethics Institute. His example should inspire employees across all industries to speak up against injustice. Carlos had been promoted to Director of Passenger Experience, a new executive-level position with authority to investigate and address discrimination complaints directly. His first initiative was establishing a confidential reporting system that would allow employees to document discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. "We're creating a culture where silence about discrimination is no longer an option," Carlos explained in his first interview since the promotion. "Every employee has a responsibility to protect passenger dignity and safety." Bradley Pierce's career destruction was complete and public. His former employer, Technova Solutions, had released a statement distancing themselves from his discriminatory comments and announcing his termination. "Mr. Pierce's statements and behavior are fundamentally opposed to our company values," the statement read. "We do not tolerate discrimination in any form, and we take full responsibility for failing to identify these concerning attitudes during his employment." Pierce was also facing civil lawsuits from Dr. Richards' legal team, who argued that his social media posts constituted conspiracy to violate her civil rights. His personal assets were being frozen pending the outcome of the litigation. Mr. Pierce actively encouraged and amplified discriminatory behavior, explained Dr. Richards' civil rights attorney. His actions weren't just morally wrong, they were legally actionable under federal civil rights law. The federal investigation had expanded to include the Department of Transportation, which announced comprehensive reviews of passenger treatment protocols across all major airlines. The investigation was revealing that discriminatory practices were widespread throughout the industry, not limited to Skybridge Airlines. What we discovered at Skybridge appears to be symptomatic of broader cultural problems in the airline industry, announced Transportation Secretary Jennifer Granholm. "We're conducting audits of passenger complaint data across all major carriers to identify patterns of discriminatory treatment." Rachel Thompson had become an advocate for passenger rights, testifying before congressional committees and speaking at civil rights conferences about the importance of bystander intervention in discrimination cases. "When we see injustice, we have a choice," she told a House subcommittee on transportation. "We can stay silent and become complicit, or we can speak up and become part of the solution. That choice defines who we are as a society." Her testimony was instrumental in advancing federal legislation that would strengthen passenger protections and require airlines to report discrimination complaints to federal authorities. The media coverage had sparked national conversations about discrimination in service industries beyond airlines. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and other businesses were reviewing their own policies and training programs to prevent similar incidents. "The Skybridge incident has become a wake-up call for American businesses," said Dr. Angela Roberts, professor of business ethics at Harvard Business School. "Companies are realizing that discriminatory treatment isn't just morally wrong. It's a business risk that can destroy reputations and trigger federal investigations." Elena Rodriguez, the gate agent who had initially witnessed Victoria's discriminatory behavior, was promoted to customer experience supervisor and tasked with training other gate agents to recognize and prevent discrimination. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said in an interview, "but I was afraid of losing my job. What I learned is that staying silent about discrimination is more dangerous to your career than speaking up about it." The incident had triggered policy changes at airports nationwide. The Federal Aviation Administration announced new requirements for discrimination reporting and passenger advocacy programs at all commercial airports. "Airports are public accommodations that must serve all passengers equally," said FAA Administrator Mike Whitaker. "We're implementing oversight measures to ensure that discriminatory treatment cannot occur unchecked in airport facilities." Dr. Amara Richards addressed the nation in her first interview since the incident, speaking with clarity about the broader implications of what had happened. "This wasn't about me personally," she said. "This was about a system that allowed discrimination to flourish because the people experiencing it lacked the power to fight back. We're changing that system so that every passenger, regardless of their wealth or influence, can expect to be treated with dignity and respect." The transformation was happening at unprecedented speed, driven by the perfect storm of clear evidence, powerful advocacy, and public outrage that the incident had created. But the real measure of success wouldn't be the immediate changes. It would be whether the airline industry could sustain a culture of equality that prevented future passengers from experiencing the discrimination that Dr. Richards had faced at 35,000 feet. 6 weeks after the incident on Flight 847, Dr. Amara Richards stood before the Skybridge Airlines Board of Directors in a conference room that had been transformed into something resembling a federal courtroom. FBI agents, Department of Justice, attorneys, civil rights advocates, and media representatives filled every available seat. The meeting wasn't just about corporate governance. It was about rebuilding an entire industry's approach to passenger treatment and civil rights. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amara began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand and emerged with the power to drive change. "We're here to discuss more than policy adjustments. We're here to talk about fundamental transformation." The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed statistics that painted a damning picture of industry-wide discrimination. Skybridge's internal investigation had revealed 847 discrimination complaints over the past 3 years, with 76% involving passengers of color and only 12% resulting in any disciplinary action against employees. These numbers represent human beings who were denied dignity, respect, and equal treatment. Amara continued, "They represent a systematic failure that we're going to correct, not with promises, but with measurable actions and transparent accountability." Federal prosecutors had already secured convictions against Victoria Cross, who received 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations and filing false police reports. Her case had become a landmark prosecution that established clear precedent for holding airline employees accountable for discriminatory behavior. Bradley Pierce had settled his civil lawsuit for an undisclosed amount and was required to complete 500 hours of community service with civil rights organizations. His case had become a cautionary tale about the legal consequences of supporting or amplifying discriminatory behavior. The individual accountability was necessary but insufficient, Amara explained to the board. Real change requires institutional transformation that addresses root causes, not just symptoms. She outlined the comprehensive reform program that would reshape Skybridge's operations. First, we're establishing the Passenger Dignity Initiative, a $50 million program that will provide mandatory bias training for every employee, create independent oversight of customer interactions, and establish financial incentives for equitable treatment of all passengers. The program was more extensive than anything attempted in the airline industry. It included partnerships with civil rights organizations, university research programs studying discrimination in service industries, and technology solutions that could identify patterns of biased treatment in real time. Second, we're implementing the Transparency Protocol, which will make all discrimination complaints public record, require federal reporting of bias incidents, and establish passenger advocacy positions at every airport where we operate. This level of transparency was unprecedented in the airline industry. Most companies treated discrimination complaints as confidential personnel matters, but Skybridge's new approach would make bias incidents as publicly visible as safety violations. Third, we're creating the Equity Investment Program, which will direct $100 million toward businesses owned by people of color, women, and other underrepresented groups. If we're going to serve diverse communities, we need to invest in diverse suppliers. The investment program addressed the broader economic implications of discrimination. By redirecting procurement spending toward diverse suppliers, Skybridge would create economic opportunities that extended far beyond its own operations. Carlos Martinez, now Vice President of Passenger Experience, presented the implementation timeline. His transformation from conflicted employee to executive leader had become a symbol of how individuals could drive institutional change. We've already retrained 2,847 employees across all operational areas, Carlos reported. Passenger satisfaction scores have increased 34% since the new protocols were implemented, and discrimination complaints have dropped 89% compared to the same period last year. The results were immediate and measurable, proving that comprehensive anti-discrimination programs could improve both passenger experience and business performance. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Civil Rights Division provided federal oversight perspective. Skybridge's transformation program exceeds federal requirements and establishes new best practices for the airline industry. Other carriers are already implementing similar programs based on this model. The federal endorsement was crucial for industry-wide adoption. When the FBI praised a company's civil rights programs, it sent a clear signal to other businesses about expectations for compliance and accountability. Rachel Thompson, now serving on Skybridge's Passenger Advisory Board, spoke about the ongoing impact of the incident. Dr. Richards' experience showed us that discrimination isn't just wrong. It's dangerous to business sustainability. Companies that don't address bias are essentially gambling with their survival. Her role as a passenger advocate had evolved into broader consulting work with other airlines, hotels, and service companies seeking to prevent similar incidents. The financial results supported the business case for comprehensive anti-discrimination programs. Skybridge's stock price had not only recovered, but reached all-time highs as investors recognized that strong civil rights protections attracted customers and reduced legal risks. Equality isn't just the right thing to do, explained Chief Financial Officer Patricia Wong. It's profitable. Our customer loyalty scores have increased 45% since implementing these programs, and our legal risk exposure has decreased dramatically. The meeting concluded with announcements about industry-wide initiatives that Skybridge would help fund and coordinate. Dr. Richards had leveraged her influence to create collaborative programs involving all major airlines. Change in one company isn't sufficient, she announced. We're establishing the Airline Equality Consortium, which will develop industry standards, share best practices, and provide support for passengers who experience discrimination anywhere in the aviation system. The consortium included all major airlines, airport authorities, and federal regulators. It represented the kind of industry-wide cooperation that typically required federal mandates, but was being voluntarily implemented in response to the Flight 847 incident. As the board meeting ended, attendees understood they had witnessed something unprecedented. A single incident of discrimination had triggered transformation that would protect millions of future passengers from experiencing the bias that Dr. Richards had faced. The accountability was real. The changes were measurable, and the impact was expanding far beyond the airline industry. The personal journeys of everyone involved in Flight 847 had become case studies in how individuals respond to crisis accountability and the opportunity for redemption or growth. Their stories illustrated that transformation was possible at every level, from corporate executives to individual passengers. Victoria Cross sat in her federal prison cell participating in a civil rights education program that she'd initially resisted but gradually embraced. The woman who had once wielded discrimination like a weapon was slowly learning to understand the harm she'd caused and the broader systems that had enabled her behavior. I spent 5 years thinking I was protecting standards she wrote in a letter to Dr. Richards that was part of her rehabilitation program. I realize now that I was just protecting my own biases and calling them professional judgment. The letter was one of dozens Victoria had written to passengers she'd mistreated over the years, part of a restorative justice program that required her to directly confront the impact of her discriminatory behavior. While some recipients chose not to respond, others engaged in dialogues that helped both sides understand the human cost of bias. Dr. Richards had responded to Victoria's letter with carefully measured compassion. Acknowledgement is the first step toward transformation. The question isn't whether you made mistakes, but whether you're committed to ensuring others don't repeat them. Victoria's case had become a model for how the justice system could address discriminatory behavior through education and accountability rather than purely punitive measures. Her prison workshops on unconscious bias were being studied by criminal justice reform advocates as an example of rehabilitation programming that could prevent future civil rights violations. Carlos Martinez had emerged as one of the airline industry's most respected voices on workplace ethics and passenger advocacy. His journey from silent witness to moral leader was inspiring similar transformations across corporate America. I spent 8 months watching discrimination happen and telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to address it, he said during a keynote speech at the National Conference on Workplace Ethics. What I learned is that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in perpetuating it. His speech had gone viral, inspiring employees across multiple industries to speak up about discriminatory practices they'd previously ignored. Companies were implementing Carlos Martinez protocols, systems that protected and rewarded employees who reported bias and discrimination. Carlos's personal life had also transformed. He'd met his fiancée, Dr. Jennifer Washington, at a civil rights conference where they were both speaking about workplace transformation. Their relationship had become a symbol of how standing up for justice could create connections and opportunities that extended far beyond the original act of courage. Rachel Thompson had channeled her experience into broader advocacy work, founding the Passenger Rights Foundation, which provided legal and financial support for travelers who experienced discrimination. Her organization had already assisted over 200 passengers in filing successful complaints and lawsuits against discriminatory treatment. Being a witness to injustice isn't enough, she explained to a congressional subcommittee considering passenger rights legislation. You have to decide whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. There's no neutral ground when it comes to civil rights. Her foundation was funded partly by Dr. Richards's Meridian Capital, but also by crowdfunding campaigns that had raised over $2 million from people inspired by her courage on Flight 847. The broad public support demonstrated how individual acts of moral courage could inspire collective action. Rachel's children had become advocates in their own right, speaking at school assemblies about standing up to bullying and discrimination. Their presentations had been viewed by over 500,000 students across the country, creating a generation of young people who understood that speaking up against injustice was both a responsibility and an opportunity to create positive change. Bradley Pierce's journey had been more difficult but equally instructive. His fall from tech executive to cautionary tale had forced him to confront biases he'd never acknowledged and privileges he'd never examined. I supported discrimination because I thought it didn't affect me, he said during a presentation to business students at Northwestern University. What I learned is that bias affects everyone by creating systems that prioritize prejudice over merit and fear over fairness. Pierce had sold his house, liquidated his investments, and used the proceeds to fund bias education programs in corporate settings. His transformation from enabler to educator was helping companies understand how seemingly successful employees could harbor dangerous biases that created legal and reputational risks. His work wasn't about redemption as much as responsibility. He'd made choices that harmed an innocent person, and he was dedicating his remaining career to preventing others from making similar mistakes. Elena Rodriguez had been promoted to Regional Director of Customer Experience, overseeing anti-discrimination programs at 15 major airports. Her initial reluctance to speak up about Victoria's behavior had motivated her to create systems that empowered employees to report bias without fear of retaliation. "I was afraid to speak up because I thought it would hurt my career," she explained to a gathering of airport employees. "What I learned is that staying silent about discrimination is much more dangerous to your career than addressing it directly." Her programs had been adopted by airports nationwide, creating standardized approaches to identifying and preventing discriminatory treatment of passengers. The success of these programs had made Elena one of the most sought-after experts in transportation industry diversity and inclusion. Captain David Bennett had taken early retirement from flying to become a consultant, helping airlines develop anti-discrimination training for flight crews. His experience managing the Flight 847 crisis had taught him that preventing discrimination required proactive leadership rather than reactive responses. "Pilots are trained to prevent problems, not just respond to emergencies," he said during a training session for airline captains. "Discrimination is a safety issue that requires the same level of attention and preparation as weather hazards or mechanical problems." His training programs had been implemented by 12 major airlines, creating standardized protocols for flight crews to recognize and address discriminatory behavior before it escalated into federal incidents. Even Michael Ross, the businessman who had live-streamed the incident, had found purpose in the aftermath. His documentation of the discrimination had provided crucial evidence for the federal prosecution, and he'd become an advocate for passenger accountability in recording and reporting bias incidents. "We all carry cameras now," he said during a digital rights conference. "The question is whether we're going to use that technology to document injustice or ignore it. Documentation creates accountability, and accountability creates change." His live stream had been viewed over 50 million times, making it one of the most watched examples of real-time discrimination documentation. Media literacy programs were using his video to teach students about the power and responsibility of citizen journalism. The personal transformations radiating from Flight 847 illustrated that crisis could catalyze growth. Accountability could inspire change, and individual courage could create collective progress that protected countless others from experiencing similar injustice. 1 year after the Flight 847 incident, the transformation of the airline industry was both measurable and profound. What had started as one flight attendant's discriminatory behavior had triggered policy changes, federal regulations, and cultural shifts that protected millions of passengers from bias and unequal treatment. The Department of Transportation announced the most comprehensive airline passenger rights legislation in 50 years, directly inspired by the Skybridge incident and modeled on the reforms Dr. Richards had implemented. The Airline Passenger Dignity Act establishes federal standards that ensure equal treatment regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, or economic background, announced Transportation Secretary Jennifer Granholm. "Every passenger deserves to travel with dignity and respect." The legislation required airlines to report all discrimination complaints to federal authorities, provided funding for passenger advocacy programs at major airports, and established criminal penalties for airline employees who filed false reports against passengers. Most significantly, the law created a national database of discrimination incidents that would identify patterns of biased treatment across airlines, airports, and individual employees. This transparency requirement had already led to the termination of over 200 airline employees with documented histories of discriminatory behavior. Skybridge Airlines had become the industry leader in passenger equity programs, with Dr. Richards's comprehensive reforms serving as the model for competitors and regulators. The airline's transformation was both thorough and profitable, proving that civil rights protections enhanced rather than hindered business performance. Our passenger satisfaction scores have increased 67% since implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination protocols, reported Carlos Martinez during an industry conference. Equal treatment isn't just morally right, it's excellent business practice. The results included reduced legal costs, improved employee morale, increased customer loyalty, and enhanced public reputation. Skybridge's stock price had reached all-time highs, making it one of the most valuable airlines in the industry. Other major carriers had implemented similar programs, often exceeding federal requirements, in recognition that strong civil rights protections provided competitive advantages in attracting diverse customers and high-quality employees. Delta Airlines announced a $75 million investment in bias prevention programs. United Airlines established passenger advocacy positions at every major hub. American Airlines created partnership programs with civil rights organizations to monitor and improve customer treatment. The entire industry has elevated its standards, said Airlines for America President Nick Callio. What started as a crisis for one company has become a transformation opportunity for all of us. The Federal Aviation Administration had implemented new training requirements that made civil rights education mandatory for all airline employees, from baggage handlers to senior executives. The training programs were developed in collaboration with civil rights organizations and used real case studies, including the Flight 847 incident, to illustrate the consequences of discriminatory behavior. Airport authorities had established passenger advocate offices at 45 major airports, providing travelers with immediate resources for reporting and addressing discriminatory treatment. These offices had already assisted over 3,000 passengers in resolving complaints and preventing escalation of bias incidents. The international impact was equally significant. The European Union had adopted similar passenger protection standards, citing the U.S. reforms as evidence that comprehensive anti-discrimination programs were both necessary and achievable. Airlines operating international routes were implementing global standards that ensured consistent treatment regardless of destination. Civil rights aren't constrained by borders, said Dr. Richards during a speech at the International Air Transport Association conference. Passengers deserve equal treatment whether they're flying domestically or internationally. Technology companies had developed new tools for identifying and preventing discriminatory treatment. Artificial intelligence systems could analyze customer service interactions to identify patterns of biased behavior, while mobile apps allowed passengers to report discrimination incidents directly to federal authorities. These technological solutions were being implemented across service industries beyond airlines, creating standardized approaches to bias prevention in hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and other businesses that served diverse customer bases. The economic impact extended far beyond policy changes. Skybridge's equity investment program had directed over $150 million toward businesses owned by people of color, women, and other underrepresented groups. This purchasing power had created jobs, expanded economic opportunities, and demonstrated how large corporations could use their resources to address historical inequities. Economic justice and civil rights are connected, explained Dr. Richards during a Harvard Business School case study presentation. Companies that ignore discrimination create inefficient markets that waste human talent and economic potential. The success of the Equity Investment Program had inspired similar initiatives across multiple industries. Corporate America was beginning to understand that diversity and inclusion weren't just moral imperatives, but competitive advantages that enhanced innovation, market reach, and long-term sustainability. Educational institutions had developed comprehensive case studies around the Flight 847 incident, using it to teach business ethics, civil rights law, crisis management, and corporate leadership. Over 200 universities were using the case to help students understand the intersection of business operations and civil rights protections. This case demonstrates how individual actions can trigger institutional transformation, said Dr. Angela Roberts, professor of business ethics at Harvard Business School. It shows students that they have the power and responsibility to create positive change in their future careers. The long-term cultural impact was perhaps most significant. The incident had sparked national conversations about discrimination, accountability, and the power of individual action that continued to influence how Americans thought about civil rights in everyday situations. Surveys showed that 78% of Americans were more likely to intervene when witnessing discriminatory treatment, up from 34% before the incident. The Flight 847 effect had created a cultural shift toward active participation in preventing bias and protecting civil rights, Dr. Richards didn't just change one airline, said Dr. Martin Foster, director of the Corporate Ethics Institute. She changed how America thinks about corporate responsibility and individual courage. That's a legacy that will protect countless people for generations. The transformation continued to expand, proving that crisis could become catalyst and individual courage could inspire collective progress that created lasting change. 2 years after Flight 847 landed in Miami, Dr. Amara Richards stood once again in the first-class cabin of a Skybridge Airlines aircraft. This time, however, she wasn't experiencing discrimination. She was participating in a ceremony that would forever change how the airline industry remembered the incident that had transformed an entire industry. The aircraft was Skybridge Flight 847, the same route where the discrimination had occurred, but now it served as a symbol of transformation rather than injustice. The seats were filled with civil rights leaders, airline executives, federal officials, and passengers who had been impacted by the reforms that followed the original incident. Carlos Martinez, now Senior Vice President of Corporate Ethics, stood at the front of the cabin addressing the assembled group. His journey from conflicted employee to industry leader had become one of the most inspiring stories of personal transformation in corporate America. 2 years ago, this aircraft was the site of systematic discrimination that violated the dignity and civil rights of Dr. Richards. Carlos said, his voice steady with emotion. Today, it represents proof that individuals have the power to create change that protects countless others. Rachel Thompson sat in Seat 3A, the same position she'd occupied when she first witnessed Victoria's discriminatory behavior. Her Passenger Rights Foundation had now assisted over 1,000 travelers in addressing bias incidents, and her advocacy had helped pass federal legislation that protected millions of people from experiencing similar treatment. I think about how different things might have been if passengers had stayed silent, she said, when called upon to speak. Dr. Richards had the courage to stand her ground, but it was the collective voices of witnesses that documented the injustice and demanded accountability. Her words resonated through the cabin because everyone understood the broader lesson: individual courage was powerful, but collective action was transformative. Captain David Bennett, who had commanded the original flight, was now serving as Director of Flight Crew Ethics Training. His presence in the cockpit 2 years earlier had been marked by uncertainty and reactive responses, but his leadership of industry-wide pilot training programs had helped prevent discrimination from recurring across the airline system. As pilots, we're trained to prevent problems rather than just respond to emergencies, he said over the cabin intercom. Dr. Richards taught us that discrimination is a safety issue that requires the same level of preparation and prevention as weather hazards or mechanical failures. Elena Rodriguez, now Regional Director of Airport Operations, spoke about the transformation of ground crew training and the empowerment of employees to report and prevent discriminatory behavior. I wish I had found the courage to speak up sooner when I first witnessed Victoria's behavior at the gate, she said. But Dr. Richards' experience taught all of us that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit in perpetuating it. Even Michael Ross, whose live streaming had documented the discrimination for millions of viewers, was present to discuss the role of technology and citizen journalism in creating accountability for biased behavior. "We all carry cameras now," he said. "The question is whether we're going to use that power to document injustice or ignore it. Documentation creates accountability, and accountability creates change." Dr. Richards listened to each speaker with the quiet dignity that had characterized her response throughout the original incident and its aftermath. When called upon to provide closing remarks, she stood and addressed the cabin with words that summarized not just her experience, but the broader transformation it had inspired. "This was never about me personally," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cabin. "This was about a system that allowed discrimination to flourish because the people experiencing it lacked the power to fight back. What we've accomplished together is proof that individual courage can inspire collective action that creates lasting change." She paused, looking around the cabin at faces that represented every aspect of the transformation. Former victims of discrimination, reformed institutions, empowered employees, and committed advocates. Every passenger who boards this aircraft now can expect to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, religion, gender, economic status, or any other characteristic that makes them unique. That's not just a policy change. That's a cultural transformation that will protect countless people we'll never meet. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a permanent plaque in the first-class cabin that read, "This aircraft honors the courage of Dr. Amara Richards and all passengers who have faced discrimination. Their experiences transformed an industry and proved that individual dignity and collective action can create lasting change." As the aircraft prepared for a symbolic flight that would retrace the original route, everyone on board understood that they were not just commemorating past injustice, but celebrating ongoing transformation that would continue protecting future generations of travelers. The emotional resolution wasn't about closure. It was about continuation of the work that would ensure discrimination never again went unchallenged in the airline industry. As we reach the end of this extraordinary story, I want to share my thoughts as the creator of this channel about what Dr. Amara Richards' experience teaches us about courage, justice, and the power each of us holds to create change. When I first heard about this incident, I was struck by how one moment of standing up to discrimination triggered transformation that protected millions of future passengers. Dr. Richards could have stayed silent, moved seats, or filed a quiet complaint that would have disappeared into corporate bureaucracy. Instead, she chose dignity over convenience, and that choice changed everything. What moves me most about this story isn't the dramatic confrontation or the satisfying accountability. It's the ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Carlos Martinez, who spoke truth to power despite risking his job. Rachel Thompson, who refused to stay silent when she witnessed injustice. Even Captain Bennett, who chose accountability over avoiding conflict. These weren't activists or civil rights leaders. They were regular people who decided that protecting someone else's dignity was more important than their own comfort. That's the real power in this story. The understanding that we all have the ability to stand up for what's right. I've been creating content about workplace justice and civil rights for 3 years now, and this case represents everything I believe about the importance of documentation, accountability, and collective action. In the age of social media, discrimination can't hide in the shadows anymore. When people have the courage to record injustice and share it with the world, change becomes inevitable. But technology alone isn't enough. It takes human beings choosing to use their voices, their phones, their positions of influence to demand better treatment for everyone. Dr. Richards had unique advantages: wealth, legal resources, business connections that allowed her to fight back in ways most people can't. but her victory created protections that benefit everyone who flies regardless of their resources or influence. That's the lesson I want you to take from this story. Your voice matters, your actions matter, and your courage to stand up for others can create change that extends far beyond whatever immediate situation you're facing. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you understand that this wasn't just about one flight attendant's bad behavior or one passenger's experience. This was about how ordinary people can work together to transform systems that harm innocent people and create cultures that protect everyone's dignity. The next time you witness discrimination, whether it's in an airport, a restaurant, a workplace, or anywhere else, remember Dr. Richards sitting calmly in seat 1A, refusing to accept unequal treatment. Remember Carlos Martinez finding the courage to contradict his supervisor. Remember Rachel Thompson deciding that silence wasn't an option. You have more power than you realize to create positive change. Use it. If this story inspired you, share it with others who need to understand that individual courage can drive collective transformation. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in justice, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. Thanks for watching. And remember, every seat on every flight belongs to anyone with dignity and a ticket.